I've been a county sheriff for 31 years. I've sat across from killers, con artists, men who smiled while lying through every tooth in their head. I thought I'd developed a certain immunity to shock. I thought nothing could catch me off guard anymore. I was wrong. It took my own son-in-law to prove that. It was the 4th of July. My wife, Pauline, had spent 3 days preparing for it. Her potato salad with the celery seed she orders online because no grocery store in Harlan County stocks it, her slow-cooked brisket, her strawberry icebox cake that my daughter had requested every summer since she was 7 years old. The house smelled like the best version of everything. My grandson, who had just turned 4, was already in the backyard with his plastic pool, shrieking every time a sprinkler hit him. My daughter, Lee, was setting the picnic table. She'd driven up from Lexington the night before. And when she'd hugged me at the door, I'd felt, for a moment, that particular relief a parent never fully loses. She's here. She's safe. Everything is fine. Her husband, Victor, had arrived 20 minutes later. He'd taken the car separately. He always seemed to arrive separately from her now. I noticed things, because that's what I do. I noticed the way Lee's shoulders tightened when she heard his tires on the gravel. I noticed the extra inch of makeup under her left cheekbone, just a shade off from her natural skin. The kind of coverage a woman learns to apply carefully. I noticed that when he came around the back and slipped his arm around her waist, she smiled, but the smile didn't reach anything above her upper lip. I'd been noticing these things for about 14 months. I hadn't said a word. Pauline had asked me twice if something was wrong between Lee and Victor, and I'd said I wasn't sure, which was technically true. I wasn't sure about the specifics. I was only sure about the category. The afternoon started fine. Victor had this way of performing. Charming, loud, the kind of man who tells a story and makes everyone feel like they're the audience of something worth watching. He grilled alongside me and called me sir, the way he always did, the way that had charmed Pauline the first time she met him. He drank 2 beers, moderate, nothing alarming. He chased my grandson around the yard and let the boy climb on his back. On the surface, it looked like any good holiday. Then Lee's phone rang. She walked toward the side of the house to take the call. I was at the grill. Victor was in the lawn chair, about 10 feet from me, and I watched him watch her walk away. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was calculation. She was on the phone for maybe 4 minutes. When she came back, she was still looking at her screen, and she said something light. Something like, "That was just Marta." And I don't know if it was the name or the fact that she volunteered it without being asked, but whatever it was, Victor didn't like it. He stood up slowly. He said her name once. Quiet. She looked up. And then everything that I'd suspected for 14 months became something I didn't suspect anymore. He hit her, open palm to the side of her face fast, the kind of hit that comes from practice. Lee stumbled sideways into the picnic table. The strawberry icebox cake went off the edge. My grandson, standing 6 feet away in his swimsuit, froze with his mouth open, water from the sprinkler still running down his back. Pauline screamed, "I don't remember setting down the tongs." Victor turned to look at me, and I will never in my life forget what he said. He pointed at Lee and said, "She knows what that was for." Then he turned to face me full on and said, "And I'd appreciate it if you stayed in your lane, old man. This is a marriage. You're just the in-laws." I looked at my daughter. She had her hand to her face. She wasn't crying. That was the part that broke me. She wasn't even surprised. I said, "Lee, take your son inside." She hesitated, looking at Victor. I said it again, "Lee, take your son inside. Right now." She did. Victor crossed his arms. He was 42 years old, 210 pounds, worked out 5 mornings a week, and he was looking at a 64-year-old man standing next to a gas grill on the 4th of July. He looked confident about the math. He said, "Don't make this into something it isn't." I didn't say anything. I went to the patio table and I picked up my phone. He said, "Who are you calling? Police?" He laughed. "You're the police, old man. You really want to make a scene at a family cookout." I wasn't calling the police. I was calling a man named Stuart Fitch. Stuart and I had gone to the same church for 22 years. We'd been in the same Sunday school class, the same men's Bible study, the same poker group that met on the second Saturday of every month at his house on Sycamore Road. 3 years ago, Stuart had retired from 30 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He'd worked fraud cases his entire career, payroll schemes, shell companies, tax evasion, dressed up in so many layers, a normal person would never find the bottom of it. I'd helped Stuart once, years back, with a property dispute involving his father's estate. It was nothing. Took me 2 phone calls and a conversation with the Wright County clerk. Stuart had told me then that I had a standing debt I could collect whenever I wanted. I'd never called it in. I called it in on the 4th of July, standing in my backyard with my daughter's fingerprints on the strawberry cake that had landed face down in the grass. Stuart answered on the second ring. I said his name. He said, "Mitchell, everything all right?" I said, "No, but it will be. I need your eyes on something." I told him the name of Victor's company, Meridian Property Solutions, and the county where it was incorporated. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. Victor had started the business 6 years ago, real estate acquisitions and management, and in 4 years it had grown from a one-man operation to something with 6 employees, 2 properties in Fayette County, and a lifestyle that never quite seemed to match the paper numbers whenever the subject came up at dinner. Stuart was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give me 48 hours." Victor was gone by the time I got off the phone. He'd taken his car, left without saying goodbye to his son. Lee was inside with the boy in her lap, reading him a picture book, like the afternoon had been entirely normal. When she looked up at me, I saw 20 years of what she'd been carrying. She said, "Dad, don't." I sat down across from her. I said, "Baby, this isn't your fault, and it isn't the first time, is it?" She looked at the book. She shook her head, just barely. I said, "How long?" She said, "It started about 2 years in." She paused. "He's never touched Cody." That was the thing she needed me to know first. I said, "He's touched you." She said, "I keep thinking I can fix it." I know that sentence. I have heard it from people sitting across a metal table in an interrogation room, from neighbors, from women at my church, from men too. I know what lives on the other side of it. I didn't argue with it that night. I just said, "You're going to stay here for a while." She said, "He'll know something is happening if I don't come home." I said, "I know, that's fine." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "What did you do?" I said, "Nothing yet. Go get Cody settled." Stuart called me back in 36 hours, not 48. He'd found enough in the first pass that he couldn't wait. He said, "Mitchell, you want the short version or the whole thing?" I said, "Give me what you've got." What Stuart had found, starting with public filings and working his way in, was a real estate operation that had 2 faces. On the surface, a legitimate property management company with tax returns, employees on payroll, a business license in good standing. Underneath, a systematic pattern of what Stuart called skimming with structure. Victor had set up a separate LLC, Capital Edge Property Services, that existed on paper in Delaware with a registered agent in Wilmington, and had run approximately $400,000 in business expenses through it over 3 years. Expenses for work that had never been done, contractors who, when Stuart checked, either didn't exist or hadn't performed the services billed. The money moved from Meridian to Capital Edge, and then, through 2 more layers, back to a personal account in Victor's name at a different bank than the one Lee knew about. That was the structure. But it wasn't the whole thing. 2 of the properties Victor managed were held in trust for elderly clients, an arrangement he'd marketed specifically to seniors who wanted professional help managing assets during estate planning. Stuart found that Victor had been charging those clients a management fee that was 3 times what was disclosed in the original agreements. The discrepancy was buried in supplemental documents that had been sent to the clients once, in small print in envelopes that looked like routine statements. One of the clients was 81 years old, the other was 77. Stuart said, "This is federal, Mitchell. property fraud, tax evasion, elder financial exploitation. Depending on how the filings break down, we're looking at 7 to 10 counts before anyone adds anything. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time after I hung up. I am not a man who has ever taken pleasure in the destruction of another person. I've sent people to prison. I've made arrests that I knew would end someone's life as they'd been living it, and I've never felt good about it. I felt that it was necessary. That's different. What I felt sitting in my truck that evening was something else. A slow, cold thing that wasn't satisfaction. It was the feeling of understanding that the man who had been eating at my table and calling me "sir" and putting his hands on my daughter in private had been running a criminal enterprise for years, and that the 2 elderly clients he'd been stealing from most certainly didn't know, and that nobody had been paying attention. I had, in 31 years of law enforcement, a number of contacts in federal agencies. I also had a contact in the Lexington field office of the FBI. His name was Garrett Oates, and we'd overlapped on a money laundering case involving a car dealership chain about 9 years back. He was sharp, methodical, the kind of man who took notes in pencil so he could erase and correct without scribble. I called Garrett on a Tuesday morning. I told him I had a referral, a solid one, with preliminary documentation from a former IRS Criminal Investigation agent. I gave him Stuart's name, Victor's company names, and the county of incorporation. Garrett said, "How solid is the documentation?" I said, "Stuart Fitch. 22 years CI, retired clean, sharp as he ever was." There was a pause. Then Garrett said, "I'll reach out to him this week." I said, "I'd appreciate sooner." He said, "I'll reach out today." I did not tell Garrett about Lee. I did not want the domestic situation coloring the financial investigation, turning it into something that could be challenged as a personal vendetta. I gave him only what was professionally relevant, and I let the work stand on its own. That was 3 weeks after the 4th of July. Lee had filed for a protective order on week 2. She'd done it herself with a family law attorney named Patricia Howe, who operated out of an office on Main Street and had handled more of these cases than I wanted to think about. Victor had been served at his office. I heard, second-hand through a mutual acquaintance, that he'd laughed when the process server came in, said something to his assistant about it being a misunderstanding. He stopped laughing within 30 days. The FBI subpoenas went to his bank, to the Delaware LLC's registered agent, to his accountant. I know because Garrett told me, in general terms, that the process was moving. I did not know the specific timeline. What I did know was the morning Lee called me, her voice somewhere between stunned and steady, and said, "Victor's company accounts were frozen this morning. He called me screaming." I said, "Are you at the house?" She said, "No, Dad. I'm here. I'm safe." She meant my house. He left 4 voicemails. I didn't listen to them. I said, "Good, don't." It unraveled the way these things do. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in a sequence of bureaucratic certainties that each removed one more wall he'd been hiding behind. The Delaware LLC was dissolved when it became clear it existed solely for financial concealment. The accountant cooperated. 3 of Victor's employees, when interviewed, provided information about billing irregularities they'd flagged internally and been told to ignore. And then the elderly clients were notified. One of them, the 81-year-old, had a son who was a retired judge in Boone County. When that family received the letter from the FBI explaining the nature of the investigation and the potential misappropriation of funds held in trust, the son called every contact he had in the Kentucky Bar Association and the state attorney general's office. That phone call added 3 state charges to the federal investigation. Victor hired a defense attorney. The attorney, from what I understood through appropriate channels, advised him to cooperate in exchange for consideration on sentencing. Victor apparently declined that advice initially. He spent approximately 3 weeks trying to find a way out that didn't exist, because Stuart's documentation had been thorough, and Garrett's team had been thorough, and the money had left clear trails even through the layers designed to obscure it. He eventually agreed to cooperate. He pleaded guilty to federal tax fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts of elder financial exploitation under Kentucky state law. The federal sentencing guidelines put him at 41 to 51 months. With the state charges, he was looking at concurrent time plus restitution. The restitution amount to the 2 elderly clients was $214,000. I learned later, much later, in a conversation with Garrett over coffee, that Victor's case had also opened a thread involving a third property, one in another county, that led to a separate investigation of a business associate of his who had been running a similar scheme independently. I hadn't known about that. I hadn't intended it. But it happened, and 2 more people who had trusted their assets to the wrong man got something back. Lee's divorce was finalized 7 months after the 4th of July. Patricia Howe was thorough and composed and had seen enough of Victor's type that nothing surprised her. Lee was awarded primary custody of Cody, child support calculated against Victor's prior income, and the equity in the Lexington property, which was sold. Lee moved back to Harlan County. She found a position with the school district. She'd always wanted to work with kids, had put it aside when Victor decided Lexington was where they needed to be. She's 3 miles from us now. Cody rides his bike to our house on weekends, and Pauline has taught him to make biscuits from scratch, and the kid is constitutionally incapable of walking into any room without announcing himself. He's exactly like his mother was at that age. I thank God for that every day. What I've learned, in 31 years of doing this work, and then once more on my own daughter's behalf, is that cruelty rarely limits itself. A man who hits his wife in private and believes he can manage the aftermath is almost always a man who has learned to manage other things the same way, through concealment, through control, through the calculation of what he can get away with. The fraud and the violence weren't 2 separate things about Victor. They were the same thing. The same belief that rules applied to everyone else. I didn't go into that 4th of July afternoon with a plan. I went in with 31 years of professional instinct and a phone with Stuart Fitch's number still in it. I made a call. I trusted the people I'd worked alongside long enough to know they were good at their jobs and cared about getting things right. That's all it took. Not a confrontation, not my fists, not a scene in my backyard that my 4-year-old grandson would carry for years. One call, placed quietly while my son-in-law stood 20 feet away, convinced he'd already won. He was wrong about a great many things. That one, I was glad to let him figure out on his own. The thing I keep coming back to, now that it's all settled, is the strawberry icebox cake lying face down in the grass. Pauline had spent 3 days on that cake. Lee had asked for it every summer since she was 7, and in about 4 seconds, one man's contempt had put it in the dirt, along with everything else he thought he could do without consequence. That's how it usually works. People like Victor don't fail in one dramatic moment. They fail because they've been making the same calculation for years, that the people around them are too afraid, too loyal, too polite, or too old to do anything about it. He looked at me standing by that grill and saw a retired man at a holiday cookout. He didn't see 31 years of knowing exactly who to call and why it mattered. I've thought a lot about what made the difference. It wasn't anger. Lord knows I had enough of that. It was something quieter. The decision to act from knowledge rather than emotion. To let the truth do the work instead of my fists. That's not easy when your daughter is standing there with her hand to her face. Every instinct I had said to handle it differently. What held me back wasn't weakness. It was the understanding that a moment of rage would have handed Victor exactly the narrative he wanted. Difficult in-laws, family conflict, nothing more. A phone call to Stuart Fitch gave him something he couldn't spin. Lee had been carrying this for 2 years before that afternoon. 2 years of covering it up, making adjustments, telling herself she could fix it. I don't say that to blame her. I say it because I've seen that same silence in people far tougher than most. And it always comes from the same place. The belief that enduring quietly is somehow protecting the people you love. Lee was protecting Cody. She was protecting me and Pauline from worry. She was protecting a version of her life she'd built and wasn't ready to let go of. What I hope she carries forward, what I'd want any person in that position to carry forward, is this: silence isn't protection. It's just a different kind of cost. The courage it takes to say, This is not acceptable, to say it out loud, to a lawyer, to a judge, to your father on a Tuesday morning. That courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision that your dignity is worth more than the discomfort of the conversation, and the intelligence to act wisely rather than just react. That matters too. I've watched good people lose everything they should have won because they let fury drive the car. They made scenes, made threats, gave the other side ammunition. Victor expected a confrontation. He was ready for one. He was not ready for Stuart Fitch, and 36 hours of forensic accounting, and a federal subpoena on a Wednesday morning. Cody is 5 now. He makes biscuits with Pauline and rides his bike to our house without calling first, which drives me crazy in the best possible way. He doesn't remember that 4th of July, or if he does, it's buried somewhere beneath every ordinary afternoon that's come after it, every biscuit, every bike ride, every evening on the porch where nobody is afraid of what happens when the wrong person walks through the door. That's what justice actually looks like, most of the time. Not a verdict, just a child who doesn't have to hold his breath anymore.